Okay, good evening and welcome. We're utilizing some old technology here since the computer that I put away before Sukkot hasn't surfaced yet. So we're using an older one here. We're going to look at this week's Torah reading, which is Parshat Noach, and we're going to also look back at Parshat Bereshit, last week's Torah reading, which sort of slipped in on us quickly. But what I want to we're going to begin by looking at chapter 11. If you want to take a look in the Chumash, and on page 48 in the Art Scroll Chumash, it's towards the end of Parshat Noach, and it's really the Tower of Babel and the dispersion, which always shocks people when they find out that it occupies all of 9 sentences in the Torah. Even though in memory banks and in our Bible story books, it certainly seems to occupy much more than that. Okay. And I want to ask a question. I think we all know the story. And the story is that the world gathered, speaking one language, set itself a goal to build this tower that was really going to go on throughout all of human history. That's really the way it's understood by the rabbis, that this was going to be the focal point of mankind for eternity, would be to build this tower. And God disrupted the plans, didn't agree with the plans, didn't destroy the world, anything similar to the beginning of the Parsha of Noach, but rather by mixing up the languages of the people, by creating Babel, as we refer to it. God was able to blunt the plans and end everything that was taking place. So that's the story in a nutshell. It happens in the year 1656 after creation. And there's a chart in the Art Scroll which will also tell us exactly how many years after the flood it happened, which I don't remember off the top of my head. Let's just see if we can document that real fast here. I'm sorry, the flood happened in 1656 after creation, and this dispersion happened in 1996. So it happened 340 years later, was the dispersion and the building of the Tower of Babel and the dispersion. And the other interesting thing, if you do the math, is that when this event happened with the Tower of Babel, Abraham was alive and well. He was already born in 1948 in this calendar. So he would have been how old? 48 years old, which is an interesting background here. But God already saw the emergence of Abraham taking place in the world. And the latest date we have for Abraham recognizing God is Maimonides' assessment that he recognized God at the age of 40. So we know that at this point already, God had a world in which an Abraham was emerging. God had promised not to destroy the world 300 years before. So God decides to disperse the world. And the provocative question I just wanted to begin with today, something we should all, let's begin by addressing it this way. If Google Translator was around at that time, would that have thwarted God's plan to thwart the building of the tower, becoming the all-consuming goal of mankind? If anybody wants to unmute themselves and offer an answer, that's what we'd like to hear. Please, Armin, if you have an idea, please let us hear from you.
Yes, me and my parents and my wife and my kids, we can all speak the same language and still don't understand each other. So it's more than just language.
Okay, but the chances are that if we gave you the task of building something together, you might be able to accomplish that. You know, it,
I'm
it,
not sure. We still maybe still get into arguments.
it wasn't so much, what's the name of that coastal village off or near San Francisco where they used to have these retreats all the time where hundreds of people.
Esalen.
What?
Esalen.
I'm trying to remember which one it was. It was a place where, the big thing was people gathered and they spent hours talking about ideas and reaching
Yeah.
consensus. What's it called?
Esalen?
Excellent. Right. Right. Thank you very much. Been a long time since I thought about that. Right. So, but here they were just engaged. And as Rabbi Meir Shapiro puts the question, it's an interesting thing to think about. He says, how difficult is it to build a building, even if you don't speak the same language? I think we could probably go to construction sites today and we would probably find workers, who speak different languages, and you use sign language. I mean, it's a pretty simple process. Do I need the hammer? All the little things they taught us when we were in afternoon Talmud Torah. I'd ask for a hammer and the guy would give me a trawl. So I would hit him in the face with the trawl and then he would hit me with the hammer and then we would fall off the scaffolding and we couldn't build the building. I mean, those problems are probably fairly readily solvable. So what Armin's pointing to is an interesting idea that what God ultimately did, and we'll read it into the words a little bit of the parsha here, was he created perspectives on life that were differing from one another, and which language basically represents. And there's many examples of this, but I would just cite, for example, in Ethics of the Fathers, where it says, who is mighty? Ezahu Gibor. And the answer, Hakovesh es Yitzro, someone who is able to overcome his own nature. So we always find, we read that mission and we say, wow, that's an interesting definition. But perhaps we might be able to say that before the Tower of Babel, everybody's concept of strength was inner strength and the ability to master yourself and master your own inclination and to basically direct your own affairs from a perspective of intelligence. So therefore, if someone said, I feel weak today, we wouldn't think, okay, I'll carry the heavy bricks for you. We might say, oh, well, then I better be careful not to say anything that might anger this person, because they're not in charge of themselves as much as they really ordinarily would be or should be. And that's what weakness would mean in contrast to being strong. Or if someone said who's smart or wise or chacham or an ashir, all these terms that are pegged in Pirkei Avot and Ethics of the Fathers and given more what we think of as moralistic definitions, I would imagine it's safe to say that before all of mankind gathered together with the shared goal of building a tower for the rest of history and building it ever higher and ever stronger and ever more insulating, which is the words of what the beginning of this chapter 11 seem to talk about. At that point, people shared definitions of words. They shared concepts. If we talked about society, if we talked about governance, democracy, beauty, whatever term we used, it had an origin of a word that we really all shared. And all of a sudden that stopped. So what really stopped then was the ability to have for an individual or even a group of individuals to convince humanity that this is the one and only goal worth pursuing. And if we all subjugate ourselves to that goal, we could achieve it forever. And that's sort of where the Migdal Bavel comes from. Now, this shouldn't sound so far-fetched to us. I mean, we're going to go into the ramifications of this a little bit differently. But, when you think about statements, and I don't want to, just a simple statement, the business of business is business, right? That's an old-fashioned phrase. So we, we're feigning shock and amazement that Facebook could imagine putting profits ahead of something else when Facebook is an enterprise, and and it sells stock, and it's a commercial enterprise. Of course, we do expect our commercial enterprises to abide by certain rules and to at least be clear that if they're making pesticide to kill rodents, that they're creating lethal products that are meant to kill, and hopefully they're used according to the instructions that are acceptable to society and not turned on other beings to destroy them, as has happened in recent history. But we really, in so many ways, we have movements that involve a sense of all for one and one for all, in the sense of monolithic thinking and buying into one perspective, one idea, and then subjugating any doubts or questions or issues that may arise in the face of that, push them aside and say, but we have to achieve our goal. And hence the famous statement of the rabbis, which I always remember when I look at this, was that the rabbi says they were building this tower. If a brick fell and broke, they stopped the work for a moment and had a moment of silence in memory of the brick, because it meant that a component of achieving their goal had been lost. Whereas if a human being fell off the scaffolding and died, the simple idea was, well, let's get another human being up here, because after all, there are enough of us to just one replace the other. And as long as we keep working on this goal tirelessly and uninterruptedly, losing a person here or there is meaningless to us, because we're still pursuing unabatedly the goal that we set, which was to build a tower forever that will become ever taller, ever stronger, ever more independent, and ever more eliminate any notion that there is a God above us. And that's sort of the gestalt of what chapter 11 is all about. And I just wanted to highlight a few words to indicate that, in the beginning on page 48, where the introductory sentence one is, so the translation in the stone, which is based on Rashi, is the whole earth was of one language and of common purpose. Even though the phrase Devarim Achodim could be translated as using one word to, all using the same word to describe a brick or a hammer or a trowel, but it's not understood that way, because otherwise it's sort of a repetitive repetition in the sentence. So we get the idea that we sometimes are very uncomfortable with, and that is that people are diverse. They see things differently. And ultimately, just a thought here, it brings us to the conclusion that discussing ideas with one another, or even having a Sanhedrin or a court consisting of 70 people where they vote on issues, is a good way of reaching the truth, because it holds the notion that no one of us has the complete truth, but that if 70 of us sat down and deliberated honestly and openly together, we could, at least on a majority basis, come up with the truth. 1 second, can you? Oh. Can people hear me? I don't think so. If you can hear me, unmute yourself and let me know.
Yeah, I
can
can
hear you.
hear you. Yeah.
You can't? Okay, good. I got a message that I was signed off, but I'm sorry. That's what, I thought I lost the connection, but everything is good. I'm sorry. So we get this idea that by honestly speaking to one another, I'm sorry about that then, because the message didn't apply to us. That by trying honestly to reach a meeting of the minds and cooperating with one another in the form of like how a Sanhedrin is set up to work, we would even have the authority to execute a person for a crime, with the sense that we've done our best to ascertain the truth, and that if the vote is 40 to 30 to convict, that we would have the confidence to do so, with the idea that we're all acting in good faith and we're acting within a system where no one of us is taking charge. We don't expect the rest of the people to subjugate their view to anybody else's. We want each person to advocate for their view. We want each person to listen to what the other one has to say. And then we reach a consensus, which means a majority opinion, and then we act on that opinion, and that's truth as we know it, or as we can come to understand it post the Tower of Babel, unlike perhaps the way it worked beforehand. Now, I want to talk for a minute about this idea of translation and what translation is all about. Because I asked the question in the beginning, could Google Translator have saved the world? By the same token, if you look at the art scroll on page 940, right at the beginning of the final book of the Torah, and I'll just add a thought here. I recently heard Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik talking about the fifth book of the Torah, the book of Devarim, and making the comment that the essence of the book was to convince the Jewish people that they could live naturally under God's rulership, and that it wouldn't be a question of ascribing their success to themselves or to luck or to nature, but rather they could, in fact, and that he felt that that's the key message that Moshe delivers to the Jewish people over and over again, is this message of live in the world in relationship to God. So what you find here on page 940, 941 in the art scroll is the following sentence. On the other side of the Jordan, sentence 5, Moses began explaining the Torah. But the Hebrew word used here is be'er es Torah hazot. He was translating the Torah. And very famously, Rashi says, understand the word be'er as translating. He began translating the Torah into the 70 languages of mankind, which of course is a direct reference back to the 70 nations that emerge out of the dispersion of the Tower of Babel. So the question is, why would Moshe have spent precious time these last days of his life translating the Torah into different languages? Number one, all the Jewish people at that point did speak the same language. They all spoke Hebrew. Number two, they were all in the same place. And so what is the Torah referring to when it says that Moshe occupied himself at these precious last days of his life to translate the Torah? And in connection with this, you find a very interesting explanation, which is that Moshe understood that over the course of Jewish history, just as it's predicted in the Torah, the Jewish people would go into exile. The Jewish people would become much more diverse in their language, in their perspectives on life, and where they live and what peoples they live amongst. And therefore, Moshe understood that for the Torah itself to survive the history of the Jewish people, he began, as it says, Ho'il Ba'er, he began translating the Torah into every language that was known or would be known to man. And what does it mean? If you think about it in these terms, it's a very challenging task. Moshe sat down and thought, okay, if the Jewish people find themselves living in Brazil, And given the structure of Portuguese, and given the mindset and the culture and the outlook and the definitions of might and wealth and greatness and beauty and all the other aspects, how could I convey or how could I preserve for their edification and uplift the words of this Torah so it would speak to them within that environment at that time, which of course is a mystical task, which is sort of beyond our ability to even conceive of. But that's really what Rashi is saying. There's Moshe said like this: my job has been to take the Jewish people out of Egypt, to bring them to Mount Sinai, to present to them God's Torah so that throughout history, the Torah would inspire us, guide us, uplift us, and connect us directly to God. And hopefully in such a way that we wouldn't feel that our job is to build a 1,000-year Reich, as German people were convinced to do in 1935. And our job isn't to simply make it onto Forbes' top tier list of wealthiest people so that we can feel as though we've succeeded, but rather the task of the Jewish people and each of us as Jewish people throughout history is to keep alive and project the wisdom, the light, uplift, and spirituality of God's Torah. So hence Moshe really undertook a project that's not written into the Torah, but Moshe really, for a moment at least, sat there opposite of the land of Israel during the last days of his life and thought to himself, what are the key ideas of the Torah that need to be translated for an 18-year-old kid growing up in San Diego, California in 2021, whose main interest in life is surfing and football. And Moshe worked at that idea, and he did some translating, some organizing of ideas, some interpretation of the Torah, so that it would be set the stage that throughout history, and no matter how dispersed the Jewish people came to be, the Torah would speak to us, and we would never find ourselves as the Jewish people in the position of those builders of the Tower of Babel, where we would be standing next to one another and we would have no way of communicating with one another. So that we, the Jewish people, would never become cut off from a connection to Torah, a connection to one another, and ultimately a connection with God. And that's the quote unquote translating, interpreting work that Moshe undertook to do. And in this sense, the reason it says Hischil, Rashi says Hitchil, he began this process, is because this is certainly our ongoing job as we have children, as we raise them, as with God's blessing, we're able to talk to our grandchildren, we're able to reach across generations, we're able to create video courses that could be watched even 100 years from now. We're continuing that process of seeking with all of our might and all of our ability to connect Torah, to make it relevant, understandable, palatable, convincing, effective, and connecting all the way through history. It's an amazing thing to think about that that's the ball that Moshe got running in the last month of his life, to make it possible for us to be able to continue to drink from the uplifting, clarifying waters of Torah wisdom that Moshe's job was to introduce to the world. And that's where this chapter of Migdal Bavel has its own special relevance to us. Because, and as Armin said cutely in the beginning, in terms of strife, in terms of overcoming separation, in terms of creating harmony, in terms of creating a sense of unity. Now understand something. There was never people as unified as were the generation of the builders of the Tower of Babel. There was ultimate harmony. one Rashi quotes a source that says that God didn't destroy the generation because of the immense peacefulness and harmony they had. But of course, we know that peace and harmony internally can take on a horrible image also. Seeing 200,000 people yelling Heil Hitler at Nuremberg, in response to a maniacal speech about how the German people are going to conquer the world and subjugate mankind and institute 1,000-year period of peace, harmony, greatness, and where the right people will be in charge and the wrong people will never get a chance to be in charge. That's also, it's beautiful to see on the level of peace and harmony. It's horrific to see when you think about the goals of mankind and the potential of joining together harmoniously to do good, as the flip side of joining together harmoniously to do evil, you see. So that's, this is some of the thinking that went into God dispersing the peoples of the world into 70 nations and therefore seeding a certain strife. The world tired of hundreds of years of warfare between whatever it is, Protestants and Catholics, or whichever, the Hatfields and the McCoys. That came from these separate identities that came out of the Tower of Babel. But by the same time, the world has resisted a monolithic embrace of evil and self-servedness and separating mankind from God, which is really what was undertaken when the Tower of Babel was being built. I want to just connect this in an interesting way, one final little section here, to the second day of creation. And I've become very intrigued with the second day of creation, and I wish I understood it a little bit better than I do right now. But if you turn to Art Scroll, and I think it's page 4, I was, over this past few days just challenging some people and asking them, we talk about 6 days of creation and the 7th day God rested. What was really created on the second day? So it's just a few sentences. God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters and let it separate between water and water. So God made the firmament and separated between the waters which were beneath the firmament and the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. God called the firmament heaven, and there was evening and there was morning, a second day. And of course, very famously, this second day of creation is distinct in that it's the only day of creation where God doesn't pronounce anything as being good. The phrase ki tov does not appear in the second day of creation. The other thing I would point out to you, this may not be unique to the second day, but it's noteworthy. The word bara, to create, is not used at all. What you have, and there are some significant differences in the viewpoints of different sages and commentaries in terms of what the ramifications of this are. But what Rashi notes here is that God created strife in the world. Okay? It uses the word mavdil, to separate. And we know that water tends to cling together, right? The idea that God split the sea was a very miraculous thing. It's not so easy for me if I have a glass of gin and tonic to order it to put the gin on the left side and the tonic on the right side of the cup. It doesn't happen very easily. So what God was doing was he was pulling apart what was seemingly a harmonious collection of water and creating out of it 2 distinct realms. Now, it's interesting to me that when I look at Rabbi Hirsch, Shamshon Hirsch's insight into this, he paints a very beautiful picture. Isn't it nice that the vapors go up to the heavens and they're collected there, and then they come down as rain and they re-nurture the earth, and sort of presents a vignette of a circle of life, and God created something that's very beautiful and orchestrated and good in the world. Um, and of course, there's truth to that depending on what the firmament means. But Rashi stresses the idea in his commentary that this idea of separation was one of strife, and the waters were arguing, I want to be in the upper waters, and I want to be in the lower waters. And then the Ramban, Nachmanides, who for various textual reasons doesn't embrace Rashi's explanation, says that what God ultimately created is he created a lofty spiritual world, and he created an earthly world, and that was the separation that took place. And that already shows us. And then, of course, the challenge then becomes that God having done that on the second day, and we deem all of creation as being preparatory for the creation of Adam and Chava, of mankind and of human beings, that challenges man to figure out a way of connecting the heaven and the earth, of connecting the upper worlds of pure spirituality with the lower world of materialistic, of earth and water. And we don't have to go all primitive here and say fire and air, but in other words, all the elements that we know make up a physical world, and which being physical automatically makes it finite, makes it limited. It takes away the attributes that God embodies, which are ones of unlimited knowledge, unlimited wisdom, unlimited strength, unlimited power, because anything that takes on any physical form whatsoever automatically becomes limited. And that's where Maimonides puts forward as a cardinal principle of Jewish thinking, is that God has no physical component whatsoever, because physicality automatically means limitation, finite, and something that could be circumvented or outsmarted or overcome, all of which were ideas that were embodied in the effort to build the tower. So hence we have this idea. And by the way, just to clarify this a little bit more, if you look in the Art Scroll Siddur, it happens to be on page 163, we have a psalm associated with each one of the 7 days of the week. And the second day has a Psalm 48 associated with it. And just to read the Art Scroll note on the Siddur, on this day, God separated between the heavenly and earthly components of the universe and ruled over both. So that's sort of taken from the Ramban's viewpoint. And then they justify, why is Jerusalem mentioned? And it's just because Jerusalem, they don't really give a good explanation on the Siddur, in my view, but Jerusalem we know it as the touch point where when God created a physical universe, that's so to speak, where the finger of God touched into materialism, and the world grew out of the place Jerusalem. So hence Jerusalem becomes a passageway and a linkage between the material and the spiritual. And hence we find ourselves oftentimes when we visit Jerusalem stirred spiritually, have a yearning to connect to God, because that's the physical point which is most set up and able to facilitate that kind of connection. So what I want to draw as a conclusion here is just two thoughts. When we talk about Emunah, and that's what the theme that I'm going to try to talk about a little bit more as we go through the book of Bereshit, we mistakenly think of Emunah as yes or no. Do you believe in God? Yes. Do you not believe in? Do I believe in God? Yes or no? Binary. And we live in a world that less and less likes binary choices. The reality is that Emunah requires some thought and definition, and maybe we'll try to get to that next week But our cardinal principles of Emunah are that God is active in the world, that 7 days of creation involve God creating a physical world separate from what we think of as a spiritual universe, which is infinite and not physical, but that God remains attached and a part of the world at every moment of time. And that speaks to a number of questions on creation, but what we say in the prayers every day, we say Hamachadesh Betuvo B'chol Yom Tamid Maaseh Bereshit. That's a phrase in the blessings. The second blessing before we say the Shema, which is that God renews or creates anew all of creation at every moment of every day. So in other words, we don't see God as ever passive. We see God as active in every single aspect of reality. That was the purpose of the plagues, to show the world, Ani Hashem B'kerev Haaretz, Exodus 8:18, that I'm God who dwells and is present in the midst of the world. So these ideas of separation, which separate people through language and through perspective and make it harder for us to really get on the same page and harder for us to achieve continuous, perfect harmony and peace between people. These limitations, though, can be overcome by utilizing our individuality in connection to other people, by respecting other viewpoints, by speaking with other people, by seeking out an opportunity to really reach truth as God gives people the opportunity to understand truth. And through that, to create a continual bridge between us spiritual souls inhabiting physical bodies living in a material world with that separated dimension of a spiritual world in which God is more openly manifest and more clearly there than we can perceive in this world, where we have to look through layers and layers of material standing between or blinding us or curtailing our view of God as the source. So this Dur Haflaga, this dispersion that happened in Bavel 1956 years after creation, 300 and some years after mankind had been wiped out with the flood at the time of Noach. This dispersion in some ways mirrors the dispersion and the separation that happened on the second day of creation, when physical and spiritual were stretched apart, where heaven and earth became two separate entities. And the challenge throughout all of this is through seeking out a connection with Hashem in a way that we really see God as being the active player in history, in nature, in our own lives, in our own beings, in our own personalities. That becomes the bridge that potentially reunites people to one another. Torah is meant to unite all Jewish people to enlighten the world, and that's what Moshe was so occupied with in the last 37 days of his life. Be'er es haTorah hazo, to explain it, to translate it, to make it, to give it a permanent presence in the minds and understanding of people. And we can do this. And that's where our emunah comes in, our faith in God giving us a Torah and giving us an opportunity to utilize our relationships with one another and our understanding of Torah and seeking out teachers of Torah and keeping Torah fresh and clear in our own minds and lives, so that we live lives where God is an active part of what's taking place in the world, and where we see any separations and diffusion that has taken place only in terms of giving us an opportunity to bridge those gaps and therefore to, in a certain sense, reunify and reharmonize the world, which really is a goal. And I'll just tell you one idea. I heard it today and I'm repeating it so that I'll remember it. And this will require a little shift in thinking. But a person is quoted as saying, we know that when Moshe entered the Mishkan and God spoke to Moshe, he spoke to Moshe from between the Kruvim, from between the two angelic forms that were sitting on top of the Aron. And just the thought question someone asked is, wouldn't it have made more sense for God's voice to have come to Moshe from the inside the ark itself? Because inside the ark itself were the tablets of law that Moshe had brought down from Mount Sinai. Good question. If you think about the picture of it and get into that a little bit, it does leave you with a question. And the answer is that the Kruvim represent our interrelationships with one another. And very famously, when times were good, the two Kruvim, the two cherubs, faced one another, they embraced one another, they were connected with one another. And when times weren't, they turned away from one another. They were reflective of the reality of the world. And this thought is that the reason why God spoke to Moshe from between the Kruvim, because the essential issue for mankind is to what extent we can harmonize amongst ourselves so that we can connect to the message, the voice, and we can hear Hashem's words speaking to us, and speaking to us in a way that's cogent, that's real, that motivates us and stimulates us and ultimately shapes the way we live our lives. And to whatever extent we can achieve that, we are certainly standing against everything that the generation of the dispersion that was out to build the Tower of Babel, everything that they were seeking, we're standing in opposition to that, because we recognize that it's through each individual adding an element to the community and to society and to the world that we could really connect with Hashem and connect with spirituality and bridge these gaps that we see so clearly around us, so that the world can become a place of peace and we can become people who reflect the enlightenment that Hashem brought into the world when he brought in the Torah. That's what I'd like us all to think about in the next couple of days. Thank you very much for participating in the class. I'll answer any questions if I can.
Thank you, Rabbi, for resuming these Torah classes. I do have a question about the motivation for building the Tower of Babel. The Art Scroll commentary says that the sages say that the tower was built to wage war against God. And that's consistent, I think, with the popular thinking that it was an aggressive movement by mankind against God in heaven. But how do you square that with the plain text that says they wanted to build a tower to avoid being dispersed across the whole earth, which is, of course, what actually happened to them?
Right. So, right. So I'll tell you, first of all, I would answer your question with a question. What would it possibly mean to wage war against God? What does that phrase mean? Were they out to kill God? Like Nietzsche?
The commentary here says that Nimrod planned to build a tower ascending to heaven and from it wage war against God.
So I'll tell you my understanding of that. It means to eliminate God from the awareness or consciousness of mankind. Now, why would Nimrod want to lead such an effort? Because Nimrod saw himself as replacing God as the top dog. And, just like the pharaohs claimed to be sons, suns, and to be sources of light to the world. In other words, what Nimrod was doing is something which we see, the Emperor of Japan going into World War II. You have people alive who could attest to this. In other words, I am it, and I think sometimes if you probably sat in some of the upper echelon boardrooms of the world, you will find individuals sitting there who also, to an amazing extent, feel I am it, or I am God, or however you want to say it, or there is nothing beyond me, beyond what I can attain, what I can achieve. And I also see it in reaction to the flood, was, people were aware that it was a traumatic idea that God could wipe us all out. So the people said, okay, we're going to create a world, we're going to build a world in which God can't lay a glove on us. You hear what I'm saying? So that's what it means to wage war on God in my mind. We're going to eliminate God as a factor in my life. And I would suggest that none of us have to go very far to find people who have done that and are doing that and are working towards that goal right alongside of us in 2021. You don't have to go very far to do that. That book Sapiens comes to mind. In a certain sense, it's this whole section of the Torah is one that I'm sure he has never come to grips with, or if he has, I'd love to hear what he has to say about it. But the idea, that, Nimrod, I think of him in my experience as Hitler standing in Nuremberg, pounding the table, yelling out at the masses, and basically saying, if you stick with me, we will together rule the world. And that's what it means to make war on God in my military academy. That's the definition of making war on God. And that's what they were out to do. And when you meet a person who we meet people like this every day, we hear these voices all the time, whether it's just whatever. We all can choose our own voices that we hear most loud. But the simple view that I am nothing more and nothing less than a container of chemicals, and and therefore, if tomorrow I strangle you to death, it's because I didn't take my meds, or because they didn't balance my inner hormones correctly, but moral responsibility doesn't really exist, since I don't see myself as a morally free, accountable person entrusted with a life and accountable to God. We all come across these attitudes often. And that's sort of the bailiwick that I put this Nimrod's leading the society in this direction.
Okay, so what you're saying is that being dispersed across the whole earth is just one example of what might happen to them unless they take matters into their own hands and rule their own destiny.
Right, and also being dispersed amongst the earth would mean that you and I would have no more viability than a chimpanzee, because we wouldn't be able to create sophisticated societies. You can understand it in a lot of different ways. People joining together is a good thing. I still think it's a good thing. Because one of the reasons I do is because if people join together and they really pay attention to one another, it changes their thinking, and it broadens a sense of perspective, and it can lead them down a pathway of really seeing God more clearly in the world. Certainly more so than just keeping my focus on my stock portfolio and waiting for the bing to go off that I've hit $1 billion, so that I can feel as though I've achieved something in my life.
Well, thank you.
Okay, thank you very, very much. And Bezrat Hashem, please God, we will connect again next week at next Tuesday night. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good night.
Have a good night. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.